Hi, everyone. I am David Lipton from The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030. Welcome to our 16th in a series of weekly podcasts. This podcast is about our republic. I have a special request. If you have enjoyed my podcasts, please subscribe and refer them to your friends and colleagues. What is a republic? Here is a pictorial image of the American Republic from 1862, at one of its most challenging moments during the Civil War. Was the U.S. a unified nation or simply a collection of individual states? Before the Civil War, the U.S. was called and referred to as these United States. But after 1865, the usage had changed to the United States, one indissoluble nation bound together by a constitution and a collective memory. Those mystic chords of memory mentioned by Lincoln in 1861 in his inaugural address. The operational premise of our constitutional republic is that we are a nation where the president and all members are elected by the people. The structure of the government outlined in the Constitution assumed a separation of powers, checks and balances between the different branches of government, and distinct powers for the federal and state governments. To protect against any tyranny of the majority, the Constitution envisaged a limited government to protect the people from the government and the people from each other. The fly in the ointment was that political parties did not exist when the Constitution was written. They only evolved and hardened into formal organizations with the specific platforms after the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800. The reason why political parties became a problem is that they are organized factions whose sole aim is to impose through legislative actions their political visions on the rest of the country. While the Constitution was being conceived, written, and debated in the late 1780s, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote the Federalist Papers to influence the framers of the Constitution and the public conventions who were to ratify it. In Federalist Paper number 10, Madison clearly foresaw and described how factions could destabilize the Republic by upsetting the delicate combination of checks and balances in the Constitution and the division of power in the government. How would that happen? Madison's definition of a faction is so prescient, it merits our full attention to our unhappy political situation today. Quote, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of the other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. End of quote. So long as factions were based on a number of citizens loosely connected to each other, there was no problem. But the moment these citizens and elected officials merged into an organized political party, as they did after 1800, the seed was planted for dissension and possible dissolution of the new government. Political parties became organized factions across a block of states. They could undermine the republic by dividing it into two hardened opposing visions on how to govern the country. This first happened between 1820 and 1860. The slave-owning interests of the South became the organized faction across the Democratic Party, both in the North and the South, while the commercial and industrial interests of the North became entrenched in the North exclusively. The Civil War was the bloody result of these two factions clashing. A similar situation is happening today, but not in the same way. It is not a dispute between specific sections of the country, one slave, the other industrial and commercial. Our contemporary clash of factions is a conflict of visions of how our republic is to be governed. It cuts across all states, dividing densely occupied centers, city centers, from suburban and rural areas. The clash of visions and factions is superbly illustrated in the Real Clear Politics website by the map of the Electoral College as it stood, according to polls, in August of 2024. The states in red and shades of red are either strongly or leaning Republican. The blue and shades of blue are leaning Democrat, and the gray states are electoral toss-ups. To get to the heart of the matter, the clash is over the role of government in our lives. Does the government that governs best governs most, or is it the government that governs best governs least? Think about it. Does any politician, to use Hamilton's words, consider, quote, the permanent and aggregate interests in the community, end of quote? Does any politician talk about the larger interests of the republic, both domestically, that's about its financial sustainability, or internationally, about the forward defense that we need to protect our country? They do not. They talk endlessly about how terrible the other candidate would be in running the country and how they would be the saviors of our nation. We, the people, the voters, are offered by the Democratic and Republican factions a combination of get-out-the-vote propaganda and catnip to goad us into the voting booths. Think about that. Let's get back to thinking of our Pledge of Allegiance that we took in public and private schools throughout our nation. Quote, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, end of quote. Bear this pledge in mind, and the republic stands. Break that pledge, and the republic dissolves. It all comes down to personal courage and to hold fast and stand steady and hold the line. Talking of courage, to hold the line, I will close this podcast with some memorable lines from another of our republic's foundational documents, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address of 1863. 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that this nation might live. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here are heartily resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. We should all remember these words. In our next podcast, we will talk about courage. It is up to us to have the courage to defend ourselves and our republic, not on a battlefield, but at the ballot box. Goodbye for now, and thank you for listening in today. Do remember to subscribe to my podcast and refer to them to your friends and colleagues. You will hear from me, David Lipton, in a week's time. You can access my ideas and thoughts by visiting Amazon.com and search for my ebook, The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030.